Imagine this. You're a Windows user who has spent years inside the same ecosystem. You know where everything lives, you know how to install programs, and you know how to fix the most common problems. Whenever someone mentions Linux, you can't help but smirk. You've heard the jokes and seen the memes. Black screens filled with white text, hackers typing green code, endless commands scrolling past. You quietly tell yourself that Linux is for programmers. Linux is for nerds, and Linux definitely isn't for normal people like you. And honestly, that belief makes sense, because it's what most Windows users have been taught to think. Linux has carried a reputation problem for a very long time. Not because Linux was bad, but because it used to be rough, unforgiving, and intimidating. Early versions of Linux demanded patience. They required learning commands. They punished mistakes. If you didn't know what you were doing, things could break in ways that felt impossible to fix. So Windows users laughed. They laughed at screenshots of terminals, laughed at people bragging about compiling kernels, laughed at forum replies that said RTFM, and then happily stayed on Windows where things felt safer and more familiar. But while the jokes continued, something important was happening quietly in the background. Linux was growing up. Not with flashy marketing campaigns or massive advertising budgets, but through thousands of developers slowly improving it year after year. Interfaces became cleaner, hardware support became better. Installers became simpler, software availability exploded. By 2026, Linux is no longer the same operating system that earned its old reputation, yet most Windows users still judge it based on a version that barely resembles what exists today. So let's talk about what happens when a typical Windows user finally decides to try Linux. Not because they want to become a hacker, not because they hate Microsoft, and not because they want to impress anyone, but simply because curiosity gets the better of them. They download a Linux distribution. Maybe they choose Ubuntu Linux because they've heard the name before and it feels safe. Maybe they pick Linux Mint because people say it's perfect for beginners and looks familiar. Maybe they go with Pop_OS because they've heard it's great for gaming and productivity. Maybe Fedora Linux catches their eye because it's modern and polished. Or maybe they feel adventurous and try EndeavourOS to get a taste of Arch Linux without suffering. No matter which one they choose, the first surprise arrives almost immediately. They boot the USB and brace themselves for complexity. They expect text screens, error messages, and confusing choices. Instead, they are greeted by a clean desktop, a mouse pointer, and a friendly graphical installer. No terminal, no commands, just a simple install button. That single moment already cracks a huge mental wall they've been carrying for years. They realize that Ubuntu Linux, Linux Mint, Pop_OS, Fedora Linux, and EndeavourOS all provide full graphical installers that guide them step by step. Choose a language. Pick a keyboard layout, select a time zone. Decide where to install. Create a user account. Click next a few times, wait a few minutes, and suddenly Linux is installed. No serial numbers. No product keys. No forced Microsoft account. No subscription prompts. For a Windows user, this feels almost unreal. When the system boots for the first time, the next shock hits. It's fast. Not pretty fast. Not fast considering the hardware. Just fast. The desktop appears quickly. Programs open instantly. The system feels light. Even on older machines or laptops that struggle with Windows 11, Linux suddenly feels alive again. Ubuntu Linux feels smooth. Linux Mint feels snappy. Pop_OS feels responsive. Fedora Linux feels polished. EndeavourOS feels blazing. This creates a quiet but powerful thought in their mind. Why does my computer feel better on something that's free? They start exploring the desktop and quickly realize nothing feels alien. There's a menu. There are icons, there's a file manager, there's a web browser. There are system settings. Everything behaves roughly the way they expect. It doesn't feel like stepping into a foreign country. It feels like stepping into a slightly different version of home. Then they open the software store, and this is where their perception begins to truly shift. On Windows, installing software usually means opening a browser, searching for a website, dodging fake download buttons, running installers, and clicking through a parade of next screens. On Linux, they simply search for an application and click install. That's it. No ads. No bundled junk. No toolbars. No trials. Just software. They install VLC. They install Discord. They install Spotify. They install LibreOffice. They install Steam. Everything shows up in one place. Everything updates automatically. Everything feels organized. It's almost suspicious in its simplicity. Then they try gaming. They expect disappointment. They expect crashes. They expect incompatibility. Instead, Steam opens, they log in, and their library is there. Many of their games install and run. Not all, but far more than they ever imagined possible. Proton and modern Linux gaming tools have quietly transformed Linux into a legitimate gaming platform. But many Windows users are still living in a mental world where Linux gaming died in 2008. Performance becomes impossible to ignore. Games run smoothly. The system stays responsive. Background processes don't choke the machine. Fans spin less. Battery life often improves. The computer feels like it's working for them, not against them. They also notice something else that feels strange at first. Linux doesn't nag them. There are no pop-ups begging them to use a specific browser. No ads in the menu. No reminders about subscriptions. No forced upgrades appearing at the worst possible moment. Updates happen when they choose. Reboots happen when they decide. Control is in their hands. Eventually, they stumble upon the terminal, the legendary black window, the symbol of everything they were taught to fear. But now, instead of dread, they feel curiosity. And they discover something shocking. They don't need it. They can use Linux perfectly fine without ever touching the terminal. Ubuntu Linux, Linux Mint, Pop! _OS, Fedora Linux, and even EndeavourOS can all be used entirely with a mouse. But once the fear is gone, curiosity takes over. They learn a few simple commands. They realize that a single line can do what would take 10 clicks on Windows. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, they feel empowered. The terminal stops being a monster and starts becoming a tool. Then comes customization, real customization. Not just changing a wallpaper or an accent color. They change panel layouts. They switch desktop environments. They try KDE Plasma. They try GNOME. They try Cinnamon. They try XFCE. They realize Linux doesn't just let you decorate your desktop. It lets you redesign your entire experience. At some point, a quiet shift happens. They still have Windows installed somewhere, maybe for a specific program or a specific game. But they start booting into Linux more often, without thinking about it, without planning it. Days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. Then one day they realize they haven't booted into Windows in a very long time. Linux has become their daily driver. Not because someone forced them, not because they joined a cult, not because they hate Windows, but because Linux simply works better for them. That's when the laughing stops. Because now, when they hear someone joke about Linux, they recognize themselves in that voice. They remember what it felt like to believe the myths. They don't get angry. They don't argue aggressively. They just smile. A knowing smile, because they know the truth. Linux doesn't need to win arguments. Linux doesn't need flashy commercials. Linux doesn't need to convince people with words. Linux only needs one thing, for people to try it. Because the moment a Windows user installs Ubuntu Linux, Linux Mint Pop! _OS, Fedora Linux, or EndeavourOS, the narrative collapses. They realize Linux isn't some weird alternative. Linux isn't the future. Linux is the present. And once they experience that for themselves, Windows users don't laugh anymore. They ask questions. They get curious. They start downloading ISOS. They start making USB drives. They start experimenting. Windows users laugh at Linux. Until they try this. And once they do, they don't laugh again.